Save account. Put your savings on autopilot so you won't even need to think about it. Turn that dream into a done with iSave from VMBS. Transformation starts here. Visit transform.myvmgroup.com. Let's go. What can you do with VM's cardless IABM deposits? If you guessed make deposits without a card, you'd be right. Deposits shouldn't slow you down. So when you get cash, you can deposit it here, or your bearer can lot it there. Send money across the island here. Pay your friend back or get paid back right there. Anyone can deposit money anytime to any VMBS account at VM IABMs nationwide with just your account and phone numbers. No card, no lines. One more way your money works better at VMBS. Transformation starts here. When you start iSaving, more things become possible. That car you've been eyeing goes from your dreams to your driveway. That big vacation moves from your wish list to a spot on the calendar. The new fridge that was once a need becomes a star of your kitchen. Supercharge your money with a high-yield iSave account. Put your savings on autopilot so you won't even need to think about it. Turn that dream into a done with iSave from VMBS. Transformation starts here. Visit transform.myvmgroup.com. Let's go. What can you do with VM's cardless IABM deposits? If you guessed make deposits without a card, you'd be right. Deposits shouldn't slow you down. So when you get cash, you can deposit it here, or your bearer can lot it there. Send money across the island here. Pay your friend back or get paid back right there. Anyone can deposit money anytime to any VMBS account at VM IABMs nationwide with just your account and phone numbers. No card, no lines. One more way your money works better at VMBS. Transformation starts here. What can you do with VM's cardless IABM deposits? If you guessed make deposits without a card, you'd be right. Deposits shouldn't slow you down. So when you get cash, you can deposit it here, or your bearer can lot it there. Send money across the island here. Pay your friend back or get paid back right there. Anyone can deposit money anytime to any VMBS account at VM IABMs nationwide with just your account and phone numbers. No card, no lines. One more way your money works better at VMBS. Transformation starts here.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am Tomlin Paul, Deputy Principal for the Mona campus, and I'm happy to be your chair for this evening's event. I'm really delighted to welcome you all to this, the third in our series of the UE VM Group Distinguished Lectures. Allow me to acknowledge the presence of the following persons. Mr. Dennis Cohen, Chairman of our campus council, the UE Mona Campus Council, Professor Denzel Williams, Pro Vice Chancellor, Principal of the UE Mona Campus, Mr. Michael McMorris, Chairman of the VM Group, Chairman of the Board, VM Group, Dr. Courtney Campbell, President and CEO of the VM Group. Professor Bharat Anand, our very special and distinguished lecturer for this evening's event. I believe we have Mr. Jonathan Cook, the Deputy High Commissioner for the British High Commission. Not sure if he should be joining us. Members of the UWI Mona Executive Management and Senior Management Team. We have a number of colleagues here with us this evening. Our Registrar, Dr. Donovan Stanberry. We have our deans, our directors, our senior leaders on the university, in the senior management. The members of the board and executive and senior management of the VM Group. We also have distinguished members from the senior management, executive management of the VM Group here with us. Ladies and gentlemen, we are also very blessed to have Sir Kenneth Hall, our former Governor General of Jamaica and former Principal of the UE Mona. Welcome. Also would like to recognize Dr. Luz Longsworth, former Principal of the UE Global Campus. Other distinguished guests from the private sector, government agencies, members of our UE Mona community, our President of the Guild of Students, Mr. Perry Cummings, our student leaders who are here with us, members of faculty and staff of the Mona campus, members of the public. Very much this event is open to our public, media representatives, and all of those who are attending this evening's event online on our YouTube UE MonaMedia channel. I'd like to also acknowledge your presence. Good evening to all, and a very warm welcome again to you on this very special evening for us here at the Mona. Series reminds me of the executive order process which Principal Denzel Williams set in place on his very first day in office. And but not only that, I must say, to support that vision of the principal, we had right there with him and with the campus community, campus administration, was the VM Group, coming together to put $20 million on the table to say, we are going to do this together. So we want to thank very much Dr. Courtney Campbell, Mr. McMorris, and the team at the VM Group for this wonderful partnership. Our Vice Chancellor, who sends his apologies, he's a believer in the university-industry engagement and partnership. And this is a fine example of such partnership that is focused on bringing thought leadership to the public. The vision of this series really is about the university addressing critical issues and talking about issues that are important for us in terms of our development, not only as a university, as an academic institution, but as an institution that's serving the region. And so this is really very special for us here at the campus in terms of our core business and our core operations. We have had a successful first year last year, and we look forward to continuing in that trend. We have a very hard-working organizing committee that has been working on this event. And this evening, we have a feast in store for you. We will hear from Professor Bharat Anand, who has braved Tropical Storm Raphael to get here. We're very happy that he was able to make it through. And he will have a full introduction later on in the program as we move forward. So we welcome you, sir, Prof. Anand, and it's really good to have you here this evening for this event. Thank you very much for joining us. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, it's a pleasure for me to invite to the podium our professor, our principal, PVC and principal of the Mona campus, Professor Denzel Williams, to bring greetings. And he will be followed immediately by Dr. Courtney Campbell, President and CEO of the VM Group, who will also bring us greetings. Principal Williams.
Wonderful, thank you. It's so good to be here this evening. Our deputy principal has done such a great job in welcoming everybody, so it makes my task much easier. I don't have to go through that inordinately long list of dignitaries. So what I would just say this evening is Your Excellency is welcome. But despite that, it would be useful for me to just recognize a few of our colleagues who have joined us for this lecture this evening. Let me first take the opportunity to welcome my friend, Bharat. I'm really happy that you're here. I know Jamaica is dear to your heart, and you do everything to come to Jamaica to get your you-know-what, yes? So happy to have you, Bharat. Thank you so much for being here. I would like to also extend, again, publicly, heartiest congratulations to Dr. Courtney Campbell on his many awards over the last few months. You have deserved everything that you've worked for, so thank you very much, sir, and we continue to look forward to the partnership. Let me also thank the members from the VM team. Chairman McMorris, thank you so much, sir, for releasing the resources so that this can happen, so thank you. Governor General, thank you so much for being here. We appreciate all the efforts and the sentiments that you have always expressed to your campus. This is still your campus. People actually still think that Professor Kenneth Hall is the principal. Yes, so so anything that goes good is yours. Thank you, sir. Our chairman of campus council, newly elected chairman, Mr. Dennis Cohen. Thank you very much, sir, for being here, and thank you very much for your leadership and guidance as well. And let me also recognize Minister Hilton, former Minister Hilton, who's this kind of event is very dear to Minister Hilton because, as you know, he shadows the investment and trade portfolio, and he is also a great thinker along these lines as well. So welcome, sir. Thank you very much. Also like to recognize our members from the private sector, our students who are here. Thank you very much for being here as well. This is very useful, and I hope that when you've heard Professor Bharat, you will say, but you is equal to Harvard. Yes? So thank you very much. Let me recognize also the members from the campus executive, members from our private sector, and all well-wishers and members from the UWI family, and also our members online. I think we have a number of persons online who have joined us this evening. So, colleagues and friends, you know, this evening is such a great evening for all of us to gather to really celebrate, again, thought leadership, and I am sure that you will be treated, as Deputy Principal said earlier, to a feast from Bharat. This is one of the evenings when the university is again providing value added to the community. And this is something that we take very seriously. We believe that as a university, our role is to help you to navigate the very volatile, complex, ambiguous world that we're living in. And because of that, we think that our role is to ensure that we provide you with the necessary tools and resources so that you can navigate this VUCA world. And this evening, we are on the cusp of something great because there are certain inevitabilities that you will not be able to escape. And one of them is AI. And so we have the right person this evening in the form of Professor Bharat Anand, a distinguished scholar who is more than capable to provide deep insights and thought to this particular subject to help us to be equipped for the uncertainties ahead as we deal with this issue of artificial intelligence, or some people call it augmented intelligence. So Bharat is not only an award-winning author in the field of strategy and technology, which makes him very suitable to provide these insights this evening. But importantly, Bharat is also a brilliant scholar and a humble and humane individual who is very passionate about social justice and also bringing knowledge to the people. And I'll give you just a little anecdote. Once Bharat and I were in a meeting, and it's a serious meeting it's supposed to be. Should I tell a story? And Bharat said, listen, I'm stopping the meeting. The George Floyd case was on. And he said, well, we have to watch this first before the meeting starts. And that shows the kind of commitment that Bharat has to see social justice. And so we really appreciate, that kind of commitment that you have for humanity. Being a brilliant scholar is one, but the ability to reach people with that scholarship is something else. And that is why we are here this evening to celebrate that transfer of knowledge. And we look forward to welcoming you to this podium to share that knowledge with us. So this evening, colleagues and friends, we are about to be treated to something great. The topic is of great interest. The subject matter is something that we have been grappling with for a while. And we are very pleased that our university can be at the forefront of bringing this knowledge to the community in a way that it is accessible to all. So thank you very much again for being here. Welcome, and we look forward to the continued partnership and look forward to the feast from Bharat this evening. Thank you.
Good evening, friends. I just want to join in acknowledging Sir Kenneth Hall, former Governor General, but also to welcome Mr. Philip Ramson, who is President of the Jamaica Chamber of Commerce, and Mrs. Audrey Togwell Henry, President of the Jamaica Bankers Association, and of course all the other dignitaries, both of the university leadership and of the VM group that have already been acknowledged. I'm really pleased to be here this afternoon as we convene for what I'm certain will be an enlightening and thought-provoking UWI Mona VM Group distinguished lecture by Professor Anand. As you know, the intention of this lecture series is to make a meaningful contribution to national and regional discourse while fostering greater collaboration between academia and industry experts. It's an ambitious promise, which has been well honored by the quality of speakers that we have had so far. We had the inaugural lecture last September, and then we had some other events in between. And now, for the second major lecture, we know that Professor Anand will certainly elevate the series' rich yield even further. For 146 years, we celebrate 146 years next week, the 14th of November, having been established November 14, 1878. For 146 years, the VM Group has been committed to uplifting Jamaicans and the nation. We have been at the forefront of financial inclusion, but whatever we are convinced is in the interest of building a stronger country, we have sacrificed and made the effort to be involved. So we firmly believe that this kind of partnership between corporate Jamaica and academia can lead to sustainable solutions to some of our most pressing regional challenges. We're therefore particularly eager to hear from Professor Anand on digital transformation, generative AI, and strategy as we, much like countless other national and regional enterprises, innovate and adapt to an ever-evolving landscape in which the fusion of strategy and technology is rapidly becoming more critical to business success. Now, recently read a research paper published on the IMF's website that outlined that since 1980, income levels in Latin America and the Caribbean have shown no convergence with those in the US, which is in stark contrast to what's happening with the emerging nations in Asia and Europe, which have seen rapid convergence. And a key factor contributing to this divergence has been sluggish productivity growth in Latin America and the Caribbean. So we complain here about our productivity challenges. It's more widespread. Low productivity growth has been broad-based across industries and firms in the formal sector, with limited diffusion of technology being an important contributing factor. As the study points out, digital technologies and artificial intelligence hold significant potential to enhance productivity in the formal sector, foster its expansion, reduce informality, and facilitate our region's convergence with advanced economies. However, lack of information, fear, and other factors present a real risk, and the region will fall behind, even further behind, advanced countries and frontier emerging markets in AI adoption. So to capitalize on the formal benefits of AI and other emerging technologies, we must remove the cloak of mystery that surrounds them, and in so doing, diminish the largely unwarranted anxieties around technology diffusion and job transitions. AI is expected to resemble previous IT innovations, such as the invention of the PC and the internet. You remember those days? You remember logging onto the internet? Who can make this? Historically, IT innovations have significantly boosted labor productivity growth. Similarly, AI is likely to enhance productivity. Also, despite the fears, AI may not reduce overall employment, at least in the short term. Technological innovations tend to increase rather than reduce overall employment, creating different jobs. Indeed, every automation wave has created new jobs that previously did not exist. But we need the information to drive thoughtful action, and that is why Professor Anand's lecture is so timely. Friends, the quality of our tomorrow depends on what we do today. So today, we happily receive this critical lecture in this partnership between the UWI Mona campus and the VM Group. Thank you on behalf of the UWI and the VM Group teams for being here. We are confident that you will be intellectually rewarded and effectively empowered. Our ask is that we all leave here this evening mindful of our responsibility to apply the lessons learned here and elsewhere to the improvement of lives and circumstances in Jamaica and the wider Caribbean. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Principal Williams and Dr. Campbell, for those opening remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll now have a cultural performance from the Classical and Jazz Ensemble. which is from our very own Philip Sherlock Center for the Creative Arts here at the UWI Mona campus. All right, thank you. Let's give them a round of applause. Really some nice rhythm there to get us in the mood for AI and all these exciting. That was AI, principal. No, it was real. All right, so ladies and gentlemen, we now have the introduction of our speaker, and that will be done via video. We have a video presentation introducing our speaker, so just let that run. We can let that roll.
Bharat N. Anand is the Vice Provost for Advances in Learning at Harvard University and the Henry R. Byers Professor of Business Administration at Harvard Business School. Professor Anand is an expert in digital strategy, digital marketing, and corporate strategy. His work has examined two central challenges that firms increasingly face: getting noticed and getting paid. He created Harvard Business School's first executive program on digital strategies for media companies. He has written over 60 articles and case studies, and his scholarly work has received various awards and been profiled in a range of media outlets. His work on digital transformation has influenced startups and established companies worldwide, and he has advised organizations across the globe. His book, The Content Trap, A Strategist's Guide to Digital Change, has received acclaim for its perspective on strategy and digital transformation. It was named as one of Fast Company's top 10 business books of 2016 and Bloomberg's best books of 2017, and by Walmart CEO Doug McMillon as his favorite book of the year. In 2014, Professor Anand helped create and launch the digital learning platforms for Harvard Business School Online and was its first senior associate dean. Harvard Business School Online's virtual classroom has been described by Fortune as the classroom of the future. In his current role as Vice Provost, he has led Harvard University's effort to formulate, communicate, and implement strategic priorities around online learning and residential teaching across the university. Professor Anand was part of Harvard's central leadership team to support and oversee the university's transition to remote teaching during the pandemic, and more recently chaired a university-wide task force that crafted a strategic roadmap for teaching and learning for Harvard University. He currently chairs Harvard's Generative AI for Teaching and Learning Task Force and is overseeing the creation of Harvard's new learning experience platform. Professor Anand is a renowned teacher and a two-time winner of the Best Teacher Award at Harvard Business School. He is a two-time recipient of the Green Hill Award for outstanding contributions to Harvard Business School. He received his BA in Economics from Harvard College, magna cum laude, and his PhD in Economics from Princeton University.
In welcoming to the podium, the UWI Mona VM Group Distinguished Lecturer 2024, Professor Bharat Anand.
Good evening. Oops. I think I can do without. I have a mic here, right? So I can. Can you hear me? No. Is this? This is good? Okay. What a pleasure to be here. What an honor. Thank you for inviting me, and thanks for those incredibly generous remarks and the video, which I had not seen till just now. So it's really an honor for me to give this lecture this evening, and thank you everyone for sponsoring this lecture and for inviting me, Denzel. I wanted to provide an overview, as was mentioned, on these topics: digital transformation, generative AI, and strategy. The odd word in that title is strategy. Because when we normally think of digital transformation or generative AI, a lot of people don't think of strategy. We're thinking about technology, we're thinking about action, we're thinking about moving fast. Strategy is like stepping back. It's like, how can you do strategy in such a fast-paced environment? And one of the things I'm going to argue is that that word is actually the key word in this title. Increasingly, we see organizations, universities, governments jumping into these kinds of arenas to try and react to these technologies. But one of the things I would like to argue is actually stepping back and trying to make sense of where this is going and what you can do as a leader, as a faculty member, in any of these arenas is probably the most critical thing. So I'll offer some insights on this as we go along. So there's a few questions that I thought we might center today's conversation on. The first is, what does it mean to win in digital arenas? And I use the word businesses pretty flexibly. We can think about this extending to nonprofit organizations. And as you'll see later when I talk about generative AI, even about country strategy and at the national level. And what does it mean to be customer-centric? We often use this word, customer-centric. What does it mean to be customer-centric in a digital world? There's several examples I'm going to draw upon, ranging from content, which I'll get to in a second, the creative industries, to commerce and retail, and of course education, which is the sector that I'm a part of and where we are today. And I'll talk a little bit about sort of our own transition in embracing digital change at a place like Harvard. Okay? The story actually goes back quite a bit. So before I get to generative AI, which is the last part of the talk, and that's more about what's happening today, I wanted to also contextualize some of these comments by really thinking about digital transformation more generally. It's interesting that we've had 30 years since the internet, right? 1994 or so. And the first set of industries that was really hit by the internet were the creative industries, the content industries. The genesis of this narrative actually, for me, doesn't start there. It actually starts much earlier. We just heard an amazing music recital. Music was in my blood growing up. I grew up in India, and so you can imagine with Bollywood and everything, the impact on pretty much everyone. But actually for me, it was personal as well. My mother had a beautiful voice. Probably the most beautiful voice I've heard. Now, every kid is going to say that about their mother. I will emphasize she had the most beautiful singing voice, like genuinely. So it starts way back, and so that was my interest in music, and of course movies in India. Had an interest in sports. This is 70s, early 80s. Actually, the story with sports and TV, for me, was a bit of a horror story. It was a bit of a horror movie, partly because of this man, Michael Holding. This was not fun to watch as someone growing up in India. In fact, the fearsome four, right, all four of them on the West Indies cricket team, and we used to see basically them just pulverizing pretty much any opposition that came through. There was a bit of a happy ending right about then. Sorry, I had to put this up. This was the first Cricket World Cup that India had won in '83, which was, of course, a major, major upset of the West Indies. And then we had an equally exciting tournament in the T20s this year. On the music side, I was talking about Indian music. When I went into high school, this was my hero. I don't know if anyone can recognize who he is. This was the lead guitarist for Led Zeppelin, Jimmy Page. And in fact, my hair was as long as Jimmy Page at the time. I have photos to prove it, but I'm not going to share those. And then towards the later part of high school, this was my hero. And then, of course, we have to have Bollywood and everything. So all of this were the kinds of topic areas I was interested in. The reason I bring this up is these were the industries hit first by the internet. It starts with newspapers. It goes into music, and I'll talk a little bit about those, then into books, then into TV, and radio, and so on. And in the 90s, when I joined Harvard Business School as a faculty member, I was deeply interested in technology, and you see the internet hitting. And I said, wow, what a great lab to study corporate change or organizational change. And that's really what got me down this path. So I refer to these industries as the canaries in the digital coal mine. Because when we talk about digital transformation today, it turns out there's a lot of lessons that we can learn from how companies and organizations in these industries adapted to digital technologies. And that's going to be one of the themes of what I talk about. So I'm going to start with this. Does anyone know what this is? Newsprint. So if you go to a newspaper printing facility, you'll see rooms with basically just this. It's just paper. This particular photo was from a plant in South Africa. And one of the questions is, what is this room going to look like 10 years from now? And of course, the answer is very different. And part of the reason is because we get news online. And what is the threat from online news? The threat is that you have a product which, unlike the print version of news, gives you real-time updating. It's much easier to search. It offers far greater variety because I'm not just getting content from one newspaper, but from all kinds of sites. Rich media format, it's not just text, but it's video and audio. Anytime, anywhere access. I don't have to wait for it to be delivered to my home in the morning. It's interactive, and people write comments, not that many people read those comments, and much lower prices. If you just look at this list of attributes, these are the dimensions on which digital is actually better than print for the reader or the consumer. Okay, so this is pretty devastating. And this is partly why news was hit first by the internet. Now here's the data on news circulation in the US over time. It's dropped by about 80%. And this is for all US newspapers. Actually, sorry, while I'm looking at this, I just realized I forgot the time axis, which is not befitting a Harvard professor. But if you were to guess, and those who read my book, please don't answer this. If you were to guess what's the exact month and date and year that this decline starts, what would you say? 1994, because of the internet. It actually turns out, I didn't leave out the time axis. This starts in the 1940s. Oh, interesting. It starts with radio. Then black and white TV. Then color TV. Then cable news. Then 24/7 cable news. Finally, the internet hits in the 90s. By the way, the impact of the internet is empirically indistinguishable from 50 years of technology that came before it. Who would have guessed? So it's puzzling because when we hear people talking about the death of newspapers, we say it's the internet. It actually started 60 years ago. In fact, journalists keep writing, this is why newspapers are in trouble. They're writing about their own business and they get it completely wrong. It turns out there is one reason for why the internet was different than TV and radio. And it comes to the following chart. Newspapers, it turns out, have three sources of revenue for the most part. One is circulation, right? Like you and I pay for the newspaper. The red line shows total circulation revenues for 25 years for all US newspapers. Those declines in circulation that I was showing you are offset one for one by price increases. Newspapers have become more expensive. So total circulation revenues are actually pretty steady over this period. Who would have thought that? So that's not getting killed by the internet. The dark blue line is advertising in the newspaper. Those big ads you see on page 3 or page 5, and nowadays in some newspapers on page 1. That accounts for about 20 to 30% of newspaper revenues, and that's basically following circulation. But the part that's really been devastated by the internet is the light blue line. The light blue line are classified advertising revenues. What are classifieds? Those job listings, you're putting homes for sale, cars for sale, you know, the stuff at the back of a newspaper, that used to account for about 50% of the revenue of most newspapers and more than half the profits. That has dropped by 90% within a decade. So classifieds went completely online. That was a major revenue stream for newspapers. But here's the puzzle. The puzzle is, when we think about why classifieds went online, The reasons are exactly the same as why online news is so great. It's faster, better, cheaper, rich media, lower prices. But the big difference is that bottom row, which is news went slowly online, classifieds went boom, like literally overnight. Why the difference? I would say this example is not just a story about news and classifieds, it's actually a metaphor for what's happening in digital transformation everywhere. Here's why. When we think about news, news is a product that you can think of as stuff that we're creating in the center of the organization, let's call it the hub, and we're distributing it to consumers who are in the spokes. The internet comes along, and suddenly we can reach many more spokes. That's all about distribution, low cost, reach, and so on. So that's part of the reason why we get excited about the internet. By the way, this notion of high reach, low distribution cost is where 90% of executives spend their time thinking about digital. And I would argue it's not the most interesting aspect of digital technologies. Because we also had high distribution and relatively low cost with TV and radio and other kinds of technologies in the past. The big difference about the internet and digital technologies is that it doesn't just allow hub-to-spoke transmission, it allows spoke-to-hub transmission. You can interact back with the hub. I can tell you what I like, what I don't like, my preferences, data, personalization. That's the second piece that's interesting about digital. But we're not done there. There's a third piece about digital which makes it even more interesting. It's not just about hub-to-spoke or spoke-to-hub. The critical feature of digital technologies is they allow spoke-to-spoke interactions. Anyone can interact with anyone else. Okay, and that's not just social media, that's just an intrinsic feature of digital technologies. So it turns out, while news was a hub-to-spoke product, classifieds was a classic spoke-to-spoke product. Newspapers were just a platform for advertisers to connect with consumers. Why is that interesting? Because in spoke-to-spoke businesses, you have what are called network effects, which is the value of the network or the business grows the more there are other buyers and sellers on that platform. Which means if you and I are competing in those kinds of businesses with the same product, but for some reason you have 50% market share and I have 30%, what happens the next period? As more consumers come in, they're more likely to choose your product. You go to 55, I go to 32. Now the difference is greater. Then you go to 63, I go to 33. And this is what starts happening, which is in spoke-to-spoke businesses or network businesses, you get winner take all or winner take most. This is partly why we see the tech giants. Most of them operate with these kinds of dynamics. Here's what's interesting about this story. When strategies based on content, if we thought our business is creating content, distributing it, we thought that was the business, as opposed to being a platform that connects buyers and sellers. When strategies based on content clash with strategies based on connections, the latter usually wins. And that's not a matter of preferences or beliefs, it's just a matter of these economics. This, I would argue, is probably the greatest opportunity for businesses and organizations and universities and so on with digital technologies, but we often miss it. So if there's one thing I'd love for you to take away from the conversation so far, is when you're thinking about exploiting digital technologies in your organization, don't just think about product distribution. Think about, are there ways we can actually create connections? Okay? Not hub to spoke, but spoke to hub. And before moving on, let me just, for a brief moment, describe what this means for online education. And we'll come back to that later on. Universities, we think of ourselves as creating content. We have content experts, the faculty. And so when the internet came, it was all about distributing that content through lectures that we would put on courses on online platforms. That's hub to spoke. By the way, most of these lectures were long. They were replicating the classroom format. I call that PDF. If there's 3 letters you should avoid, it's PDF, meaning let's just replicate the analog when we go to digital. And engagement was very low. The next thing you realize is, wait, we can actually make this interactive. We don't just need to have lectures one way. And this was the big realization for many faculty when they went to Zoom teaching. While they were giving the lecture on Zoom, students were actually using chat to ask questions. And suddenly a one-way lecture became an interactive conversation where students were answering each other's questions or the TAs were answering the questions. So that's the second part. But the third part is going beyond hub to spoke, spoke to hub, when we realized that universities, campuses, are actually fundamentally about student-to-student interactions. Students spend only 3 hours a day, roughly, in class. And maybe less than that at some universities because they're just watching the lectures online. They're spending most of the time outside class, interacting with each other, creating connections in the lunch corridor, and the gyms, and so on. So when we think about online education, maybe the big promise is not just bringing content online, but it's our ability to create connections among students online. And I'll come back and talk about this. This was a big insight for us as we were building our online platforms. Okay. So, a couple of reflections so far, just to recap. The real power of digital is not reach, but interactivity and connectedness. And in that world, let's say you've won 95% market share, I have 5%. If I come up with a better quality product, what happens? Nothing. I've got to get everyone to move at the same time. Ironically, the best quality product may not win in digital worlds. So that's something to keep in mind. And I'll start with the canonical example. Probably the greatest battle in technology, Apple versus Microsoft. When Steve Jobs introduced the Mac in 1984, 40 years ago, he had this big announcement. He didn't describe it as a great product. He called it insanely great. By the way, every time they have an announcement, they call it insanely great. No one on the planet would argue that Microsoft had a better product. Not even Bill Gates. But Bill Gates was focused on one thing, which is, how do I capture the network effect? In fact, there was a colleague who wrote a case on Microsoft back in the 90s. First line of the case, Bill Gates said, I look for businesses with network effects. Why? Because once I win in that business, there's nothing you can do. Microsoft benefited not just from one network, but 2 networks. The PC network, which was more applications, more consumers, more app developers. So that was one network. And the second is, remember, these were incompatible systems. If I was on a Mac, I could not communicate with anyone on a PC. So therefore, if everyone was on a PC, I graduate from college. Even if I've used a Mac, I enter the workplace, I am going to buy a PC. So they had 2 networks. Insanely great ends up with 3% market share. This is the reason Steve Jobs was fired. He was focusing on the wrong thing. He was focusing on product quality. Here's what's interesting, by the way. We have just gone through the greatest transformation in corporate history over the last 20 years with Apple. They were close to bankruptcy. And then they introduced the iPod, the iPhone, the everything. During that entire period, their market share in Macs in the PC market has gone from 3% to 9%. That's it. Let's put it another way. Microsoft, and my friends there allow me to say this, has made probably every mistake known to mankind when it comes to battling in technology. This was before Satya Nadella came on. And their market share dropped from 97 to 91. That's it. So, what is the lesson here? Connections or networks give you some protection when it comes to strategy. You can afford to make mistakes, but only if you've created a network and can leverage that. Okay? All right. Other examples of these, we see this everywhere. Marriott. This is a tweet from an Airbnb executive. It's a very rude tweet. I tell my students, please don't tweet like this, but let's see what it's saying. Marriott wants to add 30,000 rooms next year. We will add that in the next 2 weeks. Marriott is in the business of selling hotel rooms. Airbnb is in the business of connecting people who have rooms with people who want rooms. Same thing applies to other platforms like Uber. We're familiar with Uber and Lyft. Most people don't know that Uber actually started out with its own drivers, the black car drivers. Then when demand was getting too much, they opened it up to third-party partner drivers. And that's when this thing really explodes. Another way to say this is if you want growth, you should innovate. If you want exponential growth, you should connect. Good so far? Great. People often ask me, what's the exemplar of connections? I say it's not West, but East. It's in China. A company called Tencent. They have WeChat, but they go back 25 years. They had an instant messaging service called QQ. This is when the internet was just hitting China. On the QQ platform, you had an 8-digit number. That was your identity. Now, this was when most people in China didn't even have emails. So their 8-digit number on QQ was their online identity. The challenge for QQ is they win 95% of the market, but it's a free product. They don't know how to monetize it. So what do? They introduce basically this feature where they say you can choose your 8-digit number. For that, you just pay 99 cents. Sort of like a personalized license plate in a car. Only 3% of the market takes advantage of that feature, but with 1 billion people, that's big enough. Same thing happens when they move to, this is before broadband, so people couldn't upload pictures of themselves. So they said, okay, we'll give you 500 emojis. You can choose which one is your online identity. That's great in theory. I can choose which emoji is my online identity, except those 500 emojis are spread over 1 billion people. So we all end up looking pretty similar online. So they introduce a feature very similar to the first one, where they say, you can personalize your emoji, and get this, by buying a virtual Gucci shirt for your emoji for 99 cents. This was 6 years before NFTs and the metaverse. Only 3% takes advantage of that, but again, in a 1 billion-person market, that's big enough. This is how they start monetizing. They move from there to introduce WeChat. WeChat was a mobile instant messaging device. Most of us have seen it. In the Western world, we use WhatsApp. WeChat became not just an instant messaging device. You actually watch movies there. You can read books. You listen to music. But here's what's interesting. A few years later, they introduced something called the virtual red envelope. Now, in China, during holidays and festivals, people give red envelopes as gifts to another person with cash inside. So they introduced this virtual red envelope where if I sent it to you and you open it up, you open up the red envelope on your phone, money gets transferred from my bank account to your account. Their share of mobile e-commerce went from 19% to 37% within a month. And Alibaba couldn't react. Okay? So this is basically what they've done. Another story, coming back to newspapers, you might ask, did anyone get that classified story correct? And there are a few newspapers that got that. There's one in Norway. It's called Schibsted. Most of you have probably not heard about this. They see the classifieds problem early on. They jump into classifieds. They win classifieds in Norway. 95% market share in jobs, 95% in real estate. And by the way, they say on their website, we have 115% market share in cars. I went to them and I said, I know you guys are smart. You're not that smart. Like market shares have to add up to 100%. But they said, no, we have 115% market share. The reason was the site was so liquid that people in Germany, Denmark, and Finland were selling their cars on the Norwegian site. So they were selling more cars through their online classified site than there were cars in Norway. And they were charging $50 a listing. So they win this game, and they move from Norway to Sweden to France to like 30 other countries, and they're globally #1 in classifieds now. Okay? Just by seeing this particular issue. By the way, here's what's interesting. They then take that idea and infiltrate the newsroom. How? You remember the volcanic ash crisis 12 years ago over Iceland? Very long name of the volcano, I can't pronounce it. This ash spreads all over Europe. They start putting out stories during this crisis. The stories they put up were things we'd expect. What are the weather patterns? When is this thing going to move over? What are the health implications? Okay to inhale the ash. How did this thing form? What were the geological formations? It turns out no one was reading those stories. Why? Because during that crisis, all air travel was disrupted. The only thing that people cared about was, I'm stuck. How do I go from point A to point B? They start seeing people posting messages on their sites. Someone says, hey, is anyone going from Oslo to Trondheim? Someone else replies, I'm going. I can pick up 3 people, meet me at the train station at 3 o'clock. They go to their IT team, and they set up an app within 7 hours called Hitchhiker Central, whose only function was to allow people to share information on rides with each other. This is spoke to spoke, now infiltrating the newsroom. And this became the most popular app, not just in Norway, but all across Europe. And this led them to ask a question which now defines how they respond to every news crisis. How can we help readers help each other? Okay? All right, so the one thing I'd love for you to take away so far is not create great quality product when it comes to digital, but create to connect. Good so far? Okay. Story number 2, music. This was what happened to CDs. This makes newspapers look like a growing industry. This didn't happen over 60 years, it happened over 8 years. What killed CDs and the music industry? Piracy, Napster. 1999, Napster is introduced. 6 months later, you see the decline in CDs. Or that's the story we were told. We were told piracy killed CDs. The question you might ask is, could there be any other reason for this decline in CDs? And it turns out there was one simple explanation, which is a change in format. You just went from CDs to an MP3 format. And so people replaced CDs by MP3s. Now it turns out to see how important is the format change in explaining the decline, it turns out this is not the only period of a format change in music. We had vinyl to cassette, cassette to CD. So we said, let's go back and look at those previous format changes and see how those rates of decline compare to this, to see how much is just the format change story. And this is what we found. It literally looks identical. By the way, I didn't believe this data when my research associate came up with it. I was like, even the squiggles look similar. He's made up this data. So we went back and looked at this like 9 times. You'd also see, for those who are excited about the rebirth of vinyl, don't get too excited. It's very small, okay, at the bottom right. Now, why is this interesting? Because if you believed that piracy was killing your business, the right strategy is to get the best lawyers and figure out their IP addresses and sue them. If, on the other hand, this is simply a question of format change, the only question to ask is, how do we make money in this new format? And the answer is, oh, we can make money on the MP3 content. We can make money on hardware, iPods. Apple made a ton of money on that. Any other ways we can make money in this new digital world? Spotify, subscription-based streaming. There's one other aspect which is very interesting is thinking about what's happened to concerts. So 30 years ago, concert prices used to more or less follow the rate of inflation. The moment piracy explodes, concert prices explode. Why? Because 30 years ago, concerts were priced cheaply. They were the advertisement for you and me to go and buy the CD. Now that we can't control the price of music, that relationship flips. Free music has become the advertisement to go to the live concert, which you can't pirate. Concert prices explode. By the way, artists love this. Because on a CD, out of every $15, they only took home $1. For concerts, out of every dollar you spend, the artists take home 70 cents. Taylor Swift makes about $7 to $10 million a night. The only thing is she has to work harder. She's got a tour, okay? Now, Here's the tragedy in this story. Universal Music, which was the largest record label, sold its concerts business in 1999. Why? Because we were telling them to do that as consultants. We were saying, if there's a problem in your business, focus on what you do best, your core competence. You make CDs, that's what you do best. Save that business. But it turns out, focusing on core competence is a bad strategy when your core product is under decline. You then want to think not just about the core, you want to think more expansively about things like concerts, or what we might more generally call complements. And I'll come back to the definition in a second. Here's what happened to music. The dark line is CD sales. There's pretty much nothing you can do to stem that tide. Then you look at the lines above that. You have digital sales, you have iPod hardware sales, and you have concerts. When you add all those things together, the music industry has never been in better shape. It's just that value got distributed away from simply making content to all these complements. So what's a complement? I introduced one idea of networks. Here's my second idea. A complement is anything where the customer values your product more when he or she has the complementary product. Okay? Examples, hot dogs and ketchup. If we didn't have ketchup or mustard, the manufacturers of hot dogs would want to invent that. Cars and roads, one without the other is sort of useless, hardware and software. Here's some less obvious examples. Imagine a company that makes tires starting to tell you where the best gourmet restaurants are. According to the logic of core competence, the senior executives at Michelin should have been fired when they introduced the Red Book 100 years ago. But why did they do that? They were telling all the people in Paris about the great restaurants in the south of France. You're going to drive. It was the best complement to their core product. Movie theaters. We often go to the movies. The decline in movie viewership has been offset partly by more popcorn, bigger popcorn containers, food in the seats, bigger seats, 3D screens, HD, and so on. But there's some theaters that are doing something interesting in parts of the US and Europe, where they say, actually, one of the major reasons we stop going to the movies is when we have kids. We can't find babysitting. So they introduce childcare services right next door to the movie theater. They charge market prices for that. They double the price of the theater, and they're completely sold out. Okay? Complement. So a few ideas about complements. As digital grows, physical experiences are going to become more important. They're complements. It's interesting that live concerts, yoga festivals, all these things have become much more popular as digital has grown. Complements force you to ask the question, what business are you really in? Am I in the CD business, or am I in the business of actually thinking about just selling music and music-related products? So this is not about connections between customers that we talked about. This is about connections between products. We want to think more expansively about what business we're in. This, I think, is the big challenge that most companies face. Think of yourself in the middle of that circle. You produce content or product or whatever it is. In the outer circle, you have these big tech giants. Let's just take content as an example, but it applies to many other products. Apple still makes most of its money on hardware. If I make my money on hardware, I want the complement to be widely available and cheap. In fact, the best is if I give away a complement for free. That was the iPod strategy. I give away music for close to free, and I make money on the iPod. So they are trying to make sure that the folks in the middle circle are brutally competitive and are selling things at lower prices, or Apple will sell those at lower prices. Microsoft makes most of its money on software. They want hardware and content to be cheap. Facebook and Meta make most of the money on advertising. The Android strategy is to sell hardware for cheap, content for cheap, and software for cheap. We'll make money on advertising. Amazon The Kindle strategy, I don't make money on the Kindle, I don't make much money on the ebooks, I don't make money anywhere else, but as long as you come in the Amazon e-store and you buy the refrigerator, I'm making money. Think about what's happening. Everyone in the outer circles wants that inner circle to be brutally competitive. So if you're in that inner circle, you better watch out. Your competitors are not other content companies, they're actually these complements. We used to have this saying, content is king. By the way, that was never true. Differentiated content was king. But even if you believe content is king, think about the value created in the outer circle over the last 2 decades. It's about $10 trillion. So if you believe content is king, I would say complements are King Kong. Sorry. All right, so content is everyone else's complement, but think of content as product, okay? Here's what's interesting. Every time a new technology is introduced, media companies used to look at it as a threat. When radio came along, music companies sued to prevent the introduction of commercial radio. The Supreme Court saved commercial radio. Now, you might say that's totally natural because if you get free music, that's going to cannibalize paid music. It turns out free music through radio was the best complement because people were sampling, listening, and then they go and buy the music. The same thing happens with MTV and music, VCR and movies. Digital video recorders, you remember when they were first introduced, everyone said this is the death of television advertising. It turns out nothing happened to television advertising. Why? There's a simple reason. There was a beautiful technology for ad skipping before DVRs. It was called the neck. When an ad came on TV, it's not like we were glued to it. We went to the kitchen, we went to the bathroom, we did whatever. We were already ad skipping, it's just that now we can measure it. That doesn't mean that the technology is somehow changing ad skipping. Okay, so here's what I'd love for you to think about in your organizations. When you go digital, the temptation is let's take our product and make it digital. I take a book, I make it an ebook. The moment you do that, you're telling the reader, treat these two things as substitutes, one or the other. Actually, I want to think of digital as a complement. How do I do that? So here's a less obvious example. Sorry, I had to put this up at some point. This was Tom Brady and the New England Patriots. He's regarded as close to God in Massachusetts. When you're streaming content from TV to a mobile phone, a lot of companies were worried that the mobile phone streaming would substitute for TV viewing. That's why they resisted it. The question to ask is there a digital product that's actually a complement to TV watching? Sorry? The moment I say this is going to be obvious, fantasy football, fantasy sports. People play fantasy. Anyone played fantasy here for cricket or anything else? Yeah, a few people. So when you play fantasy, what do? You construct your own team. And the scores you get in the fantasy game are based on the real performance in the matches. So it turns out all those kids who play fantasy, they're watching every game on Sunday football. They're not just watching their local teams, they're watching blowouts. They're watching non-local teams. They're watching crappy teams because their players might be in those teams. Fantasy football turned out to be the best thing for the National Football League. And they introduced a new channel whose only function was to give scores of different players, and they made $5 billion based on that. So a question to ask is, what's your fantasy when you think about digital? All these companies, by the way, on this chart, are not companies that we would say produce great content, but they're in the business of connecting when it comes to digital. Okay, so that's the big message here. When you think about digital, don't just create, connect. It's not just creating best quality product, it's networking. It's not just continuous innovation, it's creating connections. It's not just hub to spoke, it's spoke to spoke. And it's not just copying others, it's actually thinking about what's right for you. That's the 330-page book summarized in half an hour, okay? So that's part one of what I wanted to talk about. Everyone good so far? Okay, thank you. What does this mean if we were applying these lessons to our organizations? And I'm going to give you a very personal story now. When it comes to education, so we're sitting at Harvard, We're saying, how do we think about creating online education? I was asked to lead this effort 10 years ago, partly because of my background in digital strategy. Phase one of online was hub to spoke. Harvard, MIT, Stanford, all these platforms like Coursera, Udacity, edX are created, but they're basically just putting content online. That was nice because the content was close to free, and we reach 100,000 learners through these products called MOOCs. And the idea was this will democratize education because you get high-quality content from great universities at low prices. What a beautiful vision. There were two problems. One, completion rates less than 5%. Because you got scale, but you didn't get engagement. This was just PDF. And the second thing, which was very, very sobering, was when you look at those who were actually completing these courses, 75% of people who were completing the courses already had college degrees. How counterintuitive is that? This was supposed to be for people who were less educated. It turns out the educated rich were getting richer because they were used to boring lectures and they were used to intrinsic motivation and curiosity and just watching these things. But this is not for everyone. This is what I would call the content trap literally applied to online education. By the way, there's a book called Failure to Disrupt by a colleague at MIT. It's quite interesting for those who want to know what happened during this decade. Okay, so the MOOCs were exhibit A of the content trap. We're sitting at Harvard Business School 10 years ago, thinking about what should we do. And that's when we realized this fundamental trade-off. We could record our classroom discussions, which are very dynamic. We could stream it, reach many people, but that's not going to engage the online learner. So you'll get scale without engagement. On the other hand, we could have a Zoom-type classroom where I'm running a live session with 30 students, have a class discussion virtually. You get engagement, but what's the problem? You can't scale. I've got to have live interactions with groups of 30. So how to engage at scale? Engagement at scale, I would say, is the defining opportunity and the greatest challenge for democratizing education, even today. How do we crack this trade-off? So here's what we started doing. We said, let's not do PDF. Let's think about what are the features of that case-based discussion classroom that are so rich and powerful and enlightening? And we boiled it out to three things. One is they're real-world stories. It's not just theory. Secondly, it's active learning. We can call on students in the classroom. And the third is social learning, students learning from each other. So we took these principles and we said, how can we reimagine a product based on these principles? We started building a platform with 3 courses. Here's what's interesting. After 3 months, I had 3 MBA students working with us. And I noticed they were saying something that we weren't paying attention to. They kept saying, Professor Anand, we don't just learn from the faculty in the classroom. We learn from each other in study groups, in the gym corridors, in the lunch conversations. They were talking about peer-to-peer learning. We had identified this as one of the key principles, social learning. And yet, when it came to building the platform, we got stuck in the hub-to-spoke mindset. By the way, here's what's scary about this story. I'm writing this book called The Content Trap, and we're falling into the same damn trap. This is how hard it is. It was very humbling for me. We stepped back, and we said, let's pause this project, and let's think about how to really capture social learning and interactivity. And so after a few months, we created this version of the platform. Opening page, you don't see any content. There's no courses you see. It's just a global map where you can see those pulsating bubbles. They indicate who's live from any part of the world. You can click on a bubble, it tells you who those people are, and you can start messaging them. The first day we launched this, 300 students log in online. By the end of that first day, 17,000 profile views. It turns out all they want to do is check each other out. The content can come later. Okay, it's very humbling. Like they don't. But this is how we start building relationships asynchronously. Then one of the things we realized is not just how do we replicate the class, but can we do it better? When we have an 8 or 9 page case, by the way, when students read many of these cases, all the protagonists end up looking similar. You read 30 cases on India, it's like they all look similar. Okay, I don't know who's. We realized you can actually use video online. Bring them to life. It makes it much more interesting. We can also make it much more interactive. So for instance, here's a simple concept on elasticity that we teach in economics. Instead of just defining the concept, we show a graph. We say, where would you maximize revenues? There's a little slider you move around. Based on that slider, you can see what's happening to revenues and prices. And lo and behold, at the revenue maximizing price, elasticity is exactly equal to 1. And now you're asking why. So you're backing into the notion as opposed to telling you what it is. We created something called the 3-minute rule. We said every 3 minutes, you've got to be doing something interactive on the platform. No video longer than 3 minutes, no text longer than 3 minutes of reading. So every 3 minutes, there's a poll, a reflection question, something like that. You're forced to answer the question before you move on. Social learning through discussion boards, and I won't get into the details of that, but there were many ways we tried to incentivize students to participate by just saying part of your grade depends on whether you answer other people's questions. Suddenly, everyone moves to the discussion boards. Okay? There's an interesting question about how do we know that students' answers on questions will be right? And we were worried about this, so we had content experts on standby, and we said the moment the discussion goes off in the wrong direction, we'll jump in. For the first 3 weeks, the number of times we had to jump in was exactly 0. By the way, this is not new. We've seen this with peer learning everywhere. This is the wisdom of crowds. One of our colleagues, Eric Mazur, he teaches physics. When it comes to the final exam, he first tells the students, do the exam by yourself individually, and I'll give you 1 hour. He makes the exam really hard. The average score is about 15%. Now, he's not a masochist. He's doing it for a reason. After that, he tells them the grade, but he doesn't tell them which answers they got right or wrong. For the second hour, he says now form groups of 3 to 6 and do the same exam in groups. At the end of that second hour, the average score goes from 15% to 90%. No instructor intervention. Okay, so these are the kinds of things we did. By the way, there's some things we leveraged about the classroom. There's something we do called the cold call. Okay, you'll remember it with PTSD. In a classroom, I can cold call. I can say, Denzel, what do you think? And suddenly Denzel has to pay attention. Okay? What is interesting about the cold call is he's more worried about what his classmates think about his answer than what the faculty thinks. We introduced something called the online cold call, where you're going through the online course, and suddenly at random a pop-up appears. It says, Denzel, you've been cold called. There's a clock ticking in the corner, 2 minutes or less, 30 words or less, and your answer is visible to the entire cohort with your profile picture. Suddenly they pay more attention, okay? By the way, the technology is the same. We were just thinking about ways to engage. This was the geography of conversations when we launched our online courses. Here's what's more interesting. We can actually now see when students are spending time in the courses. So we have a heat map showing which time or day of the week they're spending the most time. What would you guess? Which day? Night, and which day of the week? Sunday. Saturday. It turns out it's Wednesday night, Thursday morning. Now, why is that? There's a very simple answer. Thursday at noon was the module deadline. This is called procrastination, and we can now measure it. By the way, when we look at a procrastination index for every student and we correlate it with their final grades, there's almost a 1-to-1 correlation. So we now share this data with our students in the hopes that they would actually start doing the work earlier. Learning outcomes. You might say all this is good, but what about the outcomes? At the end of that 12-week online course, we looked at the performance of students who had 4-year college majors in that subject versus those who had taken this course for the first time in 12 weeks. And there was a difference, but there was only 3 percentage points. So this is basically how we built up our online platforms. Here, I just want to, it's hard to read this, I'll just show this to you. This is an email I got recently from someone. She wrote, I'm a professional opera singer. I was unable to perform during COVID. I was looking for stuff to do, and I came across your courses, so I took it. And then she says, what ensued was simply the most remarkable educational experience of my life. And she, by the way, already had 3 degrees from Michigan and so on. She talks about the content, which was great, the engagement. But in the last paragraph, she says, more than this, the relationships I formed and the community was really what was differentiating about this experience. Much to my surprise, despite never meeting in person, we forged strong bonds of support. And then she goes on to say, I would say that of all the social circles I'm privileged to be a part of, these are amongst my most reliable and closest friendships. This is social relationships in an entirely asynchronous world. By the way, I called her up and I said, tell me what happened. She basically played back to me every feature of the platform we had built, and she said, here's the behavior I'd introduced. She said, you created the virtual Hunger Games. Why? Because you made it hard, so we had to rely on each other for help. But then she said, you made one mistake. I said, what? She said, at the end of the course, you kicked us off the platform after you've built these social relationships. And so we had to go to WhatsApp to continue. And I was like, oh my gosh, isn't that obvious? So we're now building a new platform. We've just built it in the last 2 years, designed in part to address those kinds of features, and I hired her as a part-time advisor. The reason I say part-time is after she took this course, she started teaching at a university as an adjunct lecturer, in addition to doing opera singing, and then was appointed 4 years ago as the Cultural and Arts Ambassador in the Biden White House, only because of the skills she learned through the online education medium. These are some of the platforms we've built. This is a live classroom. It's like Zoom on steroids. We built this 8 years ago. Forbes called it the classroom of the future. Instead of 90 seats, you have 90 TV screens. And so now we can have conversations and classes with anyone, anywhere in the world. What is all this saying? It's saying the engagement versus scale trade-off can be relaxed or broken, but it requires digital-first thinking. And social capital is scalable even outside the residential experience. All right, I won't spend much time talking about COVID because I want to get to generative AI. The COVID effect was basically a triggering function because till then we were having some faculty, some students go digital. Suddenly overnight you had 100%. But I would not think of COVID as an era of online teaching. It was emergency teaching. It was not online teaching. Most universities had 9 days to prepare. In 9 days, you're not going to come up with the best product. We were fortunate that we had 6 years of history before that. The key thing was what were the learnings that came out of COVID. And there were a lot of innovations that happened. This was all captured in a report that we put out called the Harvard Future of Teaching and Learning Report. It's a public report. You can read what we described there. It's basically a blueprint for the next 10 years for what we should do at Harvard. Just to give you a little sense of some of the innovations, I talked about the Zoom chat. One of the things we could do for the first time in Harvard's history, 380 years, was we offered courses that every student in the university could take regardless of which school they were in. We could never do that earlier because if we offered a course in one school, the medical school students couldn't come 3 miles across Boston to take the course because they had to travel back and forth. Now with one click, literally everyone. We had guest experts from everywhere in the world chiming in, protagonists. Suddenly the case discussions were richer. And we started a pathway towards online degrees. Okay? All of these features come back to what I was saying earlier, which is they were leveraging either hub to spoke to hub, or spoke to spoke. So in driving organizational change, and we can spend time on this, most universities don't have burning platforms. But how do we lean into digital with a mission-oriented or an aspirational mindset? I think that's a challenge that most not just university leaders, but organization leaders ought to be thinking about. This is important when we get to generative AI. Because we might say, where do we use generative AI? It's not that obvious. But I'll come back to this idea in a few minutes. The last thing I will say is we're now moving to a world where it's not in-person or online, it's both. And a lot of that is happening through partnerships between organizations and universities, or university to university. By the way, this made news a couple of years ago when Harvard's computer science course was offered to Yale undergraduates. Imagine that. Yale undergraduates taking Harvard's course online. If Yale can do it, everyone can do it. But this was an idea where we said, let's partner with universities. It's not just taking the online course. They have TAs on the ground who are providing instruction. They do the grading. They do the credit. They do the mentoring. They do the assessment. You now get the win-win of online plus in-person. And so we've started these partnerships with many universities. And I will say that, in fact, one of the first ones was UE5 Islands. Thanks to Denzel, when he was there previously, we started a partnership with them. And this morning, we were just chatting with UE Mona about maybe trying to do this on a much bigger scale. So very excited about the potential that lies ahead. By the way, what's nice in some of this content is you're not just taking courses from Harvard. You can basically insert your own content in between the Harvard content. So you can start with a faculty member here talking about the local context. You can have examples from the local context, so it suddenly becomes a more authentic, bespoke experience. This is hybrid. It's not just digital. OK, generative AI. That was the warm-up act. I'm not going to be long here, but I'm going to leave you with some thoughts. These are headlines about generative AI and what's going to do to your business, and it's going to disrupt. The one thing I'll just say is beware of predictions. Most predictions turn out to be wrong. We saw this with the internet. Pretty much every prediction about hyper-personalized targeting, advertising being the holy grail didn't turn out to be true. So I would just say take every prediction you hear with a big grain of salt, particularly when it's coming from tech companies who are self-interested parties. Having said that, now I'm going to make some predictions. Okay. Why is generative AI interesting? So this is looking at the introduction of various technologies over time. You have computers, radio, TV, smartphones, all taking somewhere between 10 and 15 years to a few years to getting to half the US market. ChatGPT got to 50% in less than a year. OK, this is interesting. We better take it seriously. What do we know about generative AI? Here's what we know so far. It's a drastic revolution in technology that came by surprise. Its transformative potential stems from its intelligence capability, the I in AI. In other words, how smart is the output relative to the human equivalent? Prudent managers and leaders ought to wait until the technology is ready for their business, meaning as good as the human equivalent, in order to use it. It's going to lead to increases in profitability for many industries and businesses because it's widely available. And successful transformation requires leveraging existing data and layering the technology onto existing workflows. Everything I just said is probably wrong. But these are the predictions you often hear. Why is it wrong? Hopefully I now have your attention. I'm going to try and argue why they're wrong. First, this was not a technology that came by surprise. This was a natural and completely predictable, expected evolution in computing. If you look at first Moore's law, which explained how many transistors can you put on a chip, Moore's law basically operated for a good 30, 40 years. Huang's law, CEO of NVIDIA, that make GPUs or graphic processing units, the performance of those chips has doubled every year. And again, that basically follows a straight line. So there's no surprise here. In fact, even when it comes to natural language processing, we were seeing these advances over time. Increases in volume of accessible data, you can literally fit a nonlinear line perfectly to this chart. There was nothing surprising. Why is this important? Leaders can and must anticipate the trajectory of the technology over the next 5 years. There's no excuse not to. These charts will basically tell you where it's going. So that's the first piece. Second, I said generative AI's transformative potential stems from how intelligent the output is, right? The I in AI. I would argue the revolution created by ChatGPT has much less to do with the revolution in intelligence and much more to do with how the intelligence was accessed. What do I mean? For 40 years, artificial intelligence was happening. You and I didn't see those benefits. It was the software engineers, it was the coders, it was the tech experts in companies who were basically playing with AI. With ChatGPT, every single person can use ChatGPT to harness the intelligence in AI. So the big difference was not the output, it was the input, so the interface. The analogy I would draw was this was much less like the personal computer and much more like the introduction of Windows. You remember we had DOS before Windows? DOS, you needed to know these prompts, which meant only a few number of people in the world could use DOS. With Windows, a 5-year-old child could start moving the mouse. And actually, that happened with the Mac. Think of what happened with ChatGPT as Windows. That's basically what's happening. It's not, the functionality was already there. It's the access that's changed. This is my 30-second history of communication. Human-to-human communication starts around campfires, verbal. It then moves to scrolls and pictures. It then moves to writing. And it then moves to math. By the way, computer-human communication has gone exactly in the opposite direction. It started out with ones and zeros, the punch cards. It then moved to things like DOS. It then moved to Windows. And the next evolution is going to be, I don't even need to type in anything. It's just going to be audio communication. In other words, literally, we started with natural languaging, then moved to graphics, then we moved to writing, and then finally mathematics, human to human. This has gone exactly the other way. That's basically what's happening. Now, why is this interesting? If you take any organizational chart for any organization, you have senior leader, middle managers, and then the experts in particular domains. Someone can use Adobe, someone can code in Python, someone can use Excel, whatever it is. The question to ask is, what happens to this org chart when every person has access to the intelligence now? By the way, that's a conversation worth having. Okay, the question is, does the bottom layer disappear? Or the middle layer can now do what the bottom layer is doing? Or maybe we don't need that middle layer because that was just management and coordination. Some of the bottom layer people, but this is a question worth asking. Okay? So a fundamental impact of generative AI is on how the intelligence is accessed. What that means is every person in your organization can use generative AI. Your first imperative should be making sure everyone is playing with it. Just create the conditions to make sure everyone can do it. All right, so that's access. By the way, this is what we did a year ago. As was mentioned, I head the Generative AI Task Force for Teaching and Learning at Harvard. We said, we don't know what the use cases are. Let's just allow faculty to use their creative instincts to play with it. So we created a secure sandbox and basically gave them all licenses. Then several faculty started leaning into this. we videotaped all those faculty, short 5-minute videos, asking the same 3 questions. What problem were you trying to solve? How did you use generative AI? And what did you learn? All those videos are up on the Generative AI at Harvard public website. I'll come back to that in terms of, and you can watch it, by the way, but that's something I would really encourage you to do. Okay, so that's about access. Adoption. The premise was that, and this is the debates we often hear, oh, I want to use generative AI for so-and-so tasks, but it's not as good as our humans. And therefore, let's wait. I think that's the wrong dimension of trying to think about how to use generative AI in your organization. For many things, it'll never be as good as humans. But the key point here is even when there's impairment to the human equivalent value proposition, there might be value in using it only because of cost savings or time savings. What do I mean by that? Don't think about the best strategy in this world as British Airways or Emirates. Think about it as Ryanair. Low-cost airline. By the way, the service is horrible. I can't get a seat. I have to walk to the tarmac. They don't give food. And this is the most profitable airline in Europe every year for the last 30 years. I love it when my students say, every time I fly Ryanair, I hate it. I'm like, why do you keep flying? It's because it's low cost. Okay, so this is cost savings. What do I mean by cost savings? Let me just give you a simple example here. I think there's 2 dimensions in which to think about usage scenarios in your organization. One dimension is how easily available is data that I can input as the inputs into a large language model or generative AI. Some of it is codified, there's files, let's call that explicit data. Some of it is in people's head. Let's call that tacit knowledge. Okay, so that's one axis. But the other axis is actually much more interesting. It's what's the cost of errors? Not the prediction errors. What's the cost of making an error? In some cases, I might only get 70% accuracy with generative AI, but the cost of making an error is not that large, meaning the organizational cost. What's an example there? Basically, high volume data, things like customer service chatbots. In our context, universities, when I get the course evaluations from students at the end of the semester, there's 200 evaluations. It used to take me days to read those evaluations. I can just input literally those 200 evaluations into the LLM and get a good sense of what students are saying about me within 30 seconds. Will it be as good as me reading everything? No. But the cost of errors is not that big. I just want to get like the central tendency of what students are saying. So that's an example of low cost of errors. Okay? But massive time and effort savings. Second example is specialists. So we move to the bottom right, where the cost of making errors is very high. Meaning, even if you get to 95% accuracy, you don't want to use it. Legal contracts. A lot of people say law firms are going to go away. Not in the near term. Why? Because a lot of the legal contracts can basically be done by generative AI. But if I make a mistake there, it has huge consequences. So I at least want some humans in the loop to be able to check this. Okay? We don't need all the lawyers. Top left, this is tacit knowledge, meaning most of the creativity is here. Like, for instance, advertising, creative content, all those kinds of tasks. Generative AI may never be as good as truly creative individuals, but again, cost savings are massive. Right now, when I want to think about creating ad copy for, let's say, our online courses, it used to take us 2 months to go out, hire ad agencies, get people. Now, literally, I'm getting 10 visuals in 5 minutes. I do the curation task. So the curation task is still performed by humans. It's just that the creation task, you're much faster. The top right is things where I think some of the debates are falling into, which is, oh, is this as good as humans, not as good? What's the trajectory of ChatGPT? I say that's a complete red herring. We don't want to replace those tasks anytime in the future with LLMs. This is where humans are simply fundamentally better. Okay? So, 2 questions I would have you really encourage you to ask yourselves. For your organization, where does each task and function fall? In which of these 4 buckets? If it's in the bottom left, you want to be starting to adopt quickly. If it's at the top right, don't. If it's in the off diagonals, human plus AI is probably the answer. Okay? And by the way, this is where I think debates go wrong, because they say humans with AI will replace humans without AI. That's not about everything. That's just looking at 2 diagonals. Oh, generative AI is not as good as humans. They're only looking at the top right. So I think this just gives you a sense of what's really going on. By the way, you can do this for every individual. For yourself, what % of your work falls in each box? And so I'll just give you our example. When we start thinking about this, for Harvard Business School, we have 900 spots. We get about 10 to 15,000 applications every year. There's a lot of questions prospective applicants have. We don't have enough people in admissions to answer everyone. But answering them close to accurately with a chatbot based on generative AI, super helpful. Legal contracts with food service, don't want to use it. Okay, we don't want to make those errors. Designing social media content, oh my God, beautiful. Like, it can do it super quickly. We can actually start making things that are creative. Hiring faculty, please don't, Denzel. Developing or replacing disciplinary actions for students, don't do that. The cost of making errors there is super, super high. Okay? For individuals, for individual faculty, how might we think about it? Again, these are just examples. By the way, I put this tongue in cheek in the bottom left. Responding to student emails, it can do a pretty good job. I will assure you I check those emails before they go out. Writing a case study. Here's what's interesting. It takes us 9 months to write these cases. Last year, the head of the MBA program said, I want to teach a case on Silicon Valley Bank the next day. We don't have time to write a case. He goes to ChatGPT. He writes a detailed prompt. Okay? Write a case that looks like a Harvard Business School case with these sections in the case, this information. It spits out a case. He then refines it, saying, I want more information on financials, more information on competitors, less information on regulation. From beginning to end, to get a full draft of the case took him 71 minutes. Human was super important, but it was super fast. By the way, I don't share that information publicly, because think about the implication of that for the case publishing business at Harvard Business School. Okay. Brainstorming a slide for teaching, this is great. But when it comes to actually teaching in the classroom, this is not going to replace what we do. So coming back to job loss, job creation, I would say in the near term, this is going to be a beautiful complement. In the medium to longer term, it will replace certain jobs, but it's going to create a whole bunch of other new services. Okay, the last thing I just want to close on is this point about industry level impact. A lot of companies get excited and say, oh my God, let's jump in, and analysts are telling them this, and all these think tanks are telling them this. Jump in, do it, you're going to see increases in profitability. I think it's actually going to be pretty brutal for companies in the near term. Why? Because think about everything I just said. You're a company, and you say, let's follow that, and we do everything you just said. It turns out your competitor has access to the same technology in exactly the same way. So there's no differentiation if your competitors are doing it the same way as you. I think in the near term, what we'll probably see is something closer to Internet 1.0, where a lot of value was created, but there was brutal price competition, and a lot of the value went to consumers, not to the companies. That's why we had the dot-com crash. So, and by the way, we've seen this time and time again with technology. If you look at e-commerce, despite Amazon's market value and size of business, it doesn't make money on e-commerce. Most of its money comes from AWS, Amazon Web Services, from cloud computing. Walmart still makes most of its money on brick and mortar operations and makes more money there than Amazon makes in e-commerce. Netflix starts in DVDs. DVDs, old business, streaming comes along, they get super excited, they run into streaming. Oh, it turns out in DVDs, the barrier to entry was that large distribution network that they had, which no one else could replicate. In streaming, anyone can set up a streaming service. So competition is brutal. Their market value dropped by 70% when they move into streaming. And then they recovered by starting to make original content. So the head of MIT's Media Lab used to say this: the change from atoms to bits, meaning analog to digital, is irrevocable and unstoppable. It makes no sense to ship atoms when you can ship bits. I would argue he was missing something fundamental. Atoms are scarce and bits are not. And when it comes to competitive advantage for companies, you want scarcity. Of course, the MIT guys would get so intoxicated by the technology. That's a joke, by the way. So think about where you have scarcity value in your business. Okay, not about just, is the technology available? So I think in the near term, this is going to reduce profitability of industries, and it's going to require making tough and counterintuitive decisions to disrupt yourself and take certain risks. You've got to be fast because it's available to everyone. The last thing I'll say is, we often talk about how you want to use existing data, layer onto existing workflows. I would say this requires a much more fundamental rethinking. It's not just saying, where does the data sit in the organization, in files, or in text, unstructured data. It's, where does data really sit in the organization? It sits here in people's heads. Every individual in your organization is data, is a source of data. If we can capture that data, and just think about where it's being used now, meetings, for instance, right? You have the Gen AI thing, it's like a little creepy, I shut it off. But it can literally track all the conversations. At the end of it, immediately give you an action plan. By the way, it can track me in multiple meetings. It figures out my style. It's learning about me, right? That's something we can leverage, again, with care. So I would say, to really ensure long-term profitability, the firms that thrive and the organizations that thrive will have an ability not just to leverage data, but to rethink all of the assets as data. And not just to layer generative AI onto existing structures and processes and routines, but to rethink the entire organizational chart as that one I showed you. This is why I said all of this was wrong. And hopefully you can see the argument I was making, which just captures everything on this one simple cheat sheet slide. And with that, thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Professor Anand. It's really an excellent feast, and a lot of content and a lot of connections in there for the future. It's really something to think about. I think we've been exposed, colleagues, to different ways of thinking through this whole aspect of the digital transformation, and we have been provoked and stimulated here this evening. So it's my pleasure now just to invite Dr. Maurice McNaughton, who is the Director of the Center for Excellence and Innovation at the Mona School of Business, to facilitate a few questions and answers at this time.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you very much, Bharat. I say Bharat. We sat this morning at Smile Jamaica having our conversation, so I think I'm entitled to say Bharat. Yeah, but that was fascinating. Really a lot to unpack there. You know, the role that generative AI plays in this larger digital transformation agenda, I think is an interesting one for most organizations are thinking about. Digital transformation has become one of those buzz phrases. Post-pandemic, every company has a digital transformation agenda. And you know, everyone is jumping on board, public sector, private sector, academia. And in a sense, we're kind of using the term to just liberally describe anything that has to do with digitization. I think that a lot of what you have done is put this in a kind of context which says strategy is a big part of this. You know, it's not just a technology play. It's not just Courtney, and we have this conversation a lot, experimenting with technology, which can become a very expensive proposition. So the strategy of it is quite important, and I find the kind of lucidity which you expounded on that to be quite fascinating and leaves really a lot of food for thought. And I'll say to you all, if you're like me, you want to go back and watch this and listen to it again and really unpack a lot of the gems that are in there. So we're going to allow for a few questions for Prof. Anand. How are we going to do it? We have some mics. Okay, so we have a rotating microphone there. So I'll just invite people to indicate, introduce yourselves, ask a question, don't give a speech, and Bharat can respond to those.
Good afternoon.
Perhaps, Bharat, you want to come and stand.
Good afternoon.
So you can walk
My name is
around.
Peter John Gordon from the Department of Economics. My question has to do with education. As scaling becomes possible and interactions become more possible, why wouldn't the entire tertiary education sector be dominated by 2 or 3 universities around the world and everybody else go to business?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
The question was, what is the implication for universities if scaled high-quality education becomes the norm? By the way, that is what the fear was 10 years ago, which was if many of these major universities start getting into this and you really get high-quality education, what's going to happen to the medium colleges and the next tier of universities? What I said earlier about partnerships is the way I think about the answer to that. If you're a student at Adrian College in Michigan, there's a large part of your experience that has nothing to do with content transmission in the classroom. It's about the campus experience. It's about mentors. It's about advisors. By the way, it's about assessment, credit in the courses. We don't offer credit through the online courses. The president of Adrian College came to us 5 years ago, and he said, Bharat, I'd love to have a partnership with you guys. And I said, that's interesting. What would it be? He said, let me come back to you in a few weeks. He comes back, he delivers a business plan. And he said, what we'd like to do is leverage some courses that we don't offer on campus. For courses we offer on campus, there's no reason why they want to take online. But for courses we don't offer, can we get those courses at wholesale rates? And we will construct a full experience for the students which has maybe 30 or 40% online, but 60% live components. It turns out the Net Promoter Scores from that experience was much better than our online courses because students were getting a blended, richer experience. It was better not just for us, it was better for Adrian College. The students loved it. By the way, the faculty loved it because they said, for areas that I don't know much about, I don't need to go out and become an expert. I can actually leverage some of this technology, connect with the faculty of these other universities, do that, and the board of trustees loved it. That simple experiment actually shaped our thinking a lot. And we're now partnering with, we entered into a partnership with several universities in Mexico last year, where they're doing exactly that. They're taking our courses, embedding in their curriculum, making it richer. The students actually appreciate that last mile. And by the way, that's exactly what we did with 2 years ago, was it? 2 years ago with UWI. So I think it comes back to this question of tasks versus jobs. There are things I do as a faculty member that generative AI might substitute. It doesn't substitute for the entire job. It doesn't substitute for the entire experience. And I think that's where what I would call these partnerships, it's really a win-win, is the way I see this playing out in the future. By the way, is that to say that there's not going to be some disruption? I think there will be. But if you're authentic to that local, in-person, physical experience, that can add a lot of value, is the way I would think about it.
Professor Mansingh.
Hi, Bharat. Great talk. I'm Gunjan Mansingh from Department of Computing.
Yeah.
When you were talking about hub and spoke, I was just thinking about, what low cost on our learning environment, we have solutions. One is a news forum, which is a hub to scope, and one would be seen as a discussion forum where students can also post questions and you can just see some thoughts in there. But one of the things I have realized over the years, the one forum that gets cut off is the discussion forum, the spoke to spoke, because the inability to monitor it. So, meaning you were looking at Gen AI, okay, I can use Gen AI to monitor it, but is that a low cost or a high cost? What are some of the low cost spoke to spoke interactions one can have?
It's a great question. By the way, the discussion boards that I was talking about, it's very interesting when I give this talk to organizations. Sometimes I'm giving it to people in the news industry. They would often say, oh, we have spoke to spoke. And I'd say, what is it? They said the comments section. I'm like, that is a crime against humanity. Okay? Basically what they're doing is they're saying, let's spend 99% of our time thinking about content our journalists create, and then we'll slap on this discussion board and we say, oh, you guys play. The readers can come. If you spend 1% of your time thinking about how to create and structure that, what you will end up with is a bad equilibrium. Okay? And this is partly what social media has become. We spent 3 months thinking about the psychology of students in those discussion forums. As I said, the incentives. Students sometimes are afraid to ask questions. It's like, oh, if I ask a question, someone else might say, that's a stupid question. So what we did was something very simple. We said, tag your question. Tell us what kind of question it is. So you can label, I can say, hey, I'm asking an esoteric question. I'm asking a stupid question. The moment I say I'm asking a stupid question, I've taken away your right to tell me it's stupid. Okay? So there were simple things like that that we did. Incentives I talked about, which is we told students part of your grade depends on whether you answer other people's answers. The other key thing is searchability. So most discussion boards are basically, you see this long thread on the side of the platform. I have no idea which comment or question is relevant to the content. We just made it local to a page. So those were things that we did. We spent a lot of time on the design, which is partly why it worked. So that's the first thing I would say. Second thing I would say is in terms of monitoring, Gen AI absolutely can play a role because it can monitor at scale. If I tell it, here are 50 words, just flag those. The moment anyone says something like that, red flag it and bring it up to the administrator. But by the way, peers can also play a big role, particularly in the educational setting. Why is the educational setting different from a social media setting? We have an important stick, which is we say if you violate the norms of the educational community, we'll kick you off the platform. And we actually did that with a couple students, and suddenly, the quality of comments improved. But students monitor each other's comments. So if there's someone who's just making some crass comments or something which is unproductive, students can say, hey, by the way, can you guys just jump in? And so those are the low-cost ways. We're not monitoring every comment, but we're just surfacing. Does that make sense?
Oh, hi, Professor. Just had a quick question about sort of explainability in AI, because in a lot of these deep learning networks, I guess nowadays you can't really explain the answer, but I've seen a lot of research being done in the direction of explaining, you know, the results that you get. Would this kind of sort of, I guess, obviate the need of a human in the loop as such, especially in that upper right quadrant of expert?
Yeah. I mean, I think your question is a rhetorical question, which is the answer is no. Precisely in part because of what you said, which is the question was, with AI, a lot of what comes out of AI is a black box. We don't know what's actually happening. Okay, like unlike an algorithm, if I give you a statistics model, a regression model, I know exactly what the formula is. With AI, we don't know what's happening. It's just some intelligence is produced based on something that's happening. And therefore, precisely for that reason, it doesn't obviate the need for humans. But I would say there's many other reasons why humans still play a role, like the ones we were discussing, where there's, let's say, a very high cost of making an error. I don't want this to jump in. Here's what's interesting. This semester at Harvard Business School, we allowed all our students to use ChatGPT for preparing cases. So we said the assignment questions that we posted, you can, I mean, just imagine this, if that were available in your time. You can use Gen AI to answer those questions before you come to class. Now you might think that's crazy. This would completely kill the classroom discussion. It didn't at all. Why? What it does is it gets students up to speed on like the basic things. But if they're not sure, they're not sure. Like, is this thing giving me something false or true? Or I've got to defend my logic, and the best way to figure out whether you have the right logic is you answer a question I ask in class. Let's say you got it from ChatGPT. I ask the follow-up question. And suddenly you're stuck. Okay? So there's a lot of things like that that I think make it really relevant for the humans still to play that role.
Hi, good night. So I'd like to get some potential tools in the space of health and wellness.
Yeah.
So my company, my name is Andrea Jackson Robinson, and I'm the co-founder of Valentine's Intimates. So one of our key niche is around helping women to find their right fit in their foundation garment. So it takes a lot of time where we have to measure the ladies first, and then after we measure, we fit them. Are there any affordable tools from an AI perspective where you can actually do the measurement without having to physically do it? Based on your research.
Yeah. So the moment you said health and wellness, I'm saying watch out for that top right. Okay, like this is the debate. It's like, I don't want to be giving advice where that cost of errors and a lot of the knowledge is tacit knowledge. But here's what I would suggest. I posed 2 questions about, think of what tasks maybe fall in the other 3 buckets. That's the exercise I would do. I don't know particular measurement tools for that particular industry, but that's the exercise I would do. The things that fall in the bottom left, by the way, when you look at organizations, a few simple things often come up. Summaries, translation, okay? Data analysis, those are all things in the bottom left. Like we can do that pretty well, not much cost of errors, and huge time and effort savings. Those are the places I would probably focus. By the way, there's something really interesting also I would just add as an anecdote. The thing I've tried to avoid is go deep into the technology, as was mentioned. The thing I'd love for you to take away is not just strategy, but behavior. What are the behavioral implications of all this? And I'll just mention one example. The sandbox that I said we created for Harvard students and faculty, we said don't use ChatGPT public because you don't know what's secure, what's not secure. The information you upload could be used in training data. So we created the sandbox. We said this is a secure environment. Adoption rate by our faculty was pretty high. Adoption rate by our students, 10%. So you might say, what's going on there? So we went and asked students, hey, like, are you using the sandbox? They're like, no. What do you mean? Don't you use ChatGPT? Oh, yeah, we use ChatGPT. We just use the public version. Are you aware of the sandbox? Oh, we're totally aware of the sandbox. Why do you think they're going to OpenAI's public version, even though it's not secure? They're saying, we don't want you as faculty members seeing what we're doing. Just think about that for a moment, okay? They're going to the less secure, they trust OpenAI more than the Harvard sandbox. I don't think this is a coincidence. The reason is when you talk to faculty and you say, what are you most concerned about Gen AI? They say student cheating. If the number one thing we start with is saying we're concerned about cheating by students, students are hearing that. They're saying, okay, if that's how you think, we're not going to come and play in the same sandbox. So I think there's a lot of behavioral aspects here, particularly when it comes to things like your business and industry, health and wellness, right? It's like there's a lot of behavioral issues which I would really hone in on fundamentally.
There's an online question.
Can you speak about the reasons companies are hesitant to adopt AI at an organization-wide level?
Yeah. Great. So the question is, can you explain why companies are hesitant to adopt AI at an organization-wide level? And I would say there's a few reasons embedded in what I was saying. In fact, this last example is one, which is just how we perceive risk and privacy within the organization. I would say there's a few others. Going back to that 2x2 chart, as I said, I think the debate is misplaced. Because the debate oftentimes is, where is this as good as humans? It's focusing on only one part of that box. If we start at the bottom left, suddenly opportunities open up. So literally when I've done this with organizations, and I say, what tasks would fall in that bottom left? Oh my God, like within half an hour, they think of like 20 tasks. How many of those are you doing? Maybe 5. Oh, you've literally just given us a laundry list of things we can adopt. So that's I think the other piece is, here's what's starting to happen. Even if a lot of tasks can be replaced by Gen AI, or not replaced, even done by Gen AI when we weren't doing them, the CFO is often saying, where are these savings showing up in the P&L? I don't see them showing up anywhere. In fact, we're paying all like these millions of dollars to OpenAI for the licenses and Microsoft. I'm not seeing this show up in my bottom line. And part of the reason is, coming back to what I was saying, supposing 20% of the tasks you do can be done by Gen AI. What have you done with that 20% of time savings?
Yeah.
Is it actually like we're reallocating that to different tasks, or is it just, or is it more work? Do you know what I'm saying? So I think that's the relevant question. The other piece is the job redesign, which is to really make sure that you want to leverage this. It's not just saying, let's add it to existing tasks and jobs. We've got to rethink that org chart. Very, very few organizations are doing that. Okay, so I would say that's probably where it's going to come.
I think we have one more question over here. And Chair, should we just allow maybe one other after this?
Hello, everyone. I'm Ashanti Lawson, journalist from Sun City Radio FM. So I have just one question for you.
Are we on radio?
No, you're not, but you will be. With AI making decisions faster and I would say smarter than most humans, in many areas, I would say, how or where do you see the human element remaining irreplaceable, especially in areas like leadership and strategy, as you mentioned?
Great. I think you've answered the question, which is when we ask organizations to say what's in that top right, setting a vision, setting strategy, right? Those kinds of management decisions which require discretion, I think the importance of management is actually going to go up, not down, in certain ways. You know, it goes back to when we were thinking about, but the example I gave in our setting, I don't think there's any time soon where it's going to replace us interacting with students in the classroom. And so now if you think, how much time do I spend on thinking about teaching compared to the 15 other mundane tasks I'm doing? Oh, maybe I'll spend more time actually thinking about teaching and research. There was a really interesting set of articles that came out after ChatGPT was introduced. And I'd encourage actually looking at this. The first came out a couple months later. It was written by a high school English teacher. He wrote this piece in The Atlantic. It said, "The Death of High School English." And the argument was, if students can basically use this to write essays, like, we're done. 6 months later, he wrote another piece in The Atlantic. I forget the exact title. It was called "The Golden Age of High School English," or something like that. And he said, basically, we used to give all these written assignments when actually the thinking process, the discussion process we have in class is the most important ingredient for writing. And now we're spending more time on that. It's a little bit like the calculator when it first came out, right? Like, people are like, oh my gosh, if you have the calculator, no one will learn any math. I mean, it is true that kids today can't do multiplication tables like we did. But that's not relevant. I will say, when I was a freshman at Harvard, I took a chemistry course. I used to love chemistry. Okay, I hope this is not being streamed. I used to love chemistry in high school. I get to college, and the faculty member said, you've got to memorize pKa values, pH values, and log tables. And we're like, why? Log tables, like you have the tables. And his answer was, because I did it 30 years ago. That is not a good answer. Okay. So part of the question is, if it's going to happen, it's going to happen. Let's actually focus on the things where truly the human is going to be important. And I think there's going to be a lot of areas. Yeah.
All right. Outstanding. We possibly have one more. Oh, Sir Rain. Two more? Okay, two more.
Okay, I have two questions. One is, I'll tag my questions. One is completely open-ended, and the other is very specific. The open-ended question, what is the future of truthful, objective journalism in the world we're going into? And the second one is, if I were a 22-year-old graduate of this university who wants a career in journalism, what direction should I take?
Thank you. What an easy question to end on. So this is actually near and dear to my heart, because a lot of my research was actually about the media. Here's a couple things I'll say. One, when we think about things like bias, or, by the way, verifiably false information, verifiably false, we see very little of. Bias, we see a lot of. Okay, because that's non-verifiably false information. That exists everywhere, okay? But here's the part that's sobering, is that if you and I look at a particular media outlet, chances are we'll disagree on what the direction of bias is. Meaning most people don't agree on what an objective measure of bias is. This was true in the media research 50 years ago. Literally, they used to get on the facts on X, Y, and Z topic. That's a set of questions. Second set of questions is, what are your beliefs about whether crime is too high, too low? So that's more about beliefs as opposed to facts. And the third is, who would you vote for? It turns out it has a big effect on knowledge of the facts. So misinformation can affect what you believe are the facts. It has almost no effect on beliefs and voting behavior. So in other words, it's like, I'll just take the facts to suit my beliefs. Is sort of one way to think about it. And I think that's a bigger problem that we're seeing, which is we know there's verifiably false information that people are using, but the question is, if you had different information, would they actually change their beliefs? Like that's the deeper question. The last part I'd just say is, if you look at media coverage, I think they're contorting themselves in all different ways. The journalists are doing a great job, but the journalists haven't caught up with strategy. Meaning, how do we actually cover news events in a way that matters to changing people's perceptions of the issues? Okay, that's a loaded statement, but I'm just going to leave it at that. My advice is, journalism is an amazing profession where 20 years ago we thought this is all going to be replaced. Applications to journalism schools are actually increasing. And part of this is precisely because of the premise in your question, which is, what is responsible journalism actually doing in today's day and age? And the answer is a whole lot.
Okay, excellent. I think that we have taken our last question. And of course, well, you have the mic and you're standing. Shall we?
Yeah.
Please, go ahead. Absolute last question.
This to the mic on.
We're not hearing very well.
Thank you. Good night. My name is Karen Ramson. I am a graduate of UE. My background is psychology and sociology. When you began your speech, you said strategy is the main oddity in this here. What I found in your discussion was that in doing partnerships, you're elevating schools and students and academia, bringing them up in a way that would take years to do manually. When you do that, you're elevating the education, which now elevates the input into what goes into AI later. When we do that, if we look at it as change and fear, then we will always fight against it. But if we look at it that we're elevating our global society on this level, then it means that that top box that we're so worried about, the lawyers, the lecturers, the human element, is so much further ahead that it almost becomes impossible to get rid of them. And then it will let the other three boxes raise almost as complements. So that's what I got from it, and it really helped me to look at it more than a fear, because if we elevate everybody and the input is elevated, then the output is going to be elevated. So thank you.
Thank you, thank you. I thought you were going to go in a different direction, which is to say that most of my talk was about sociology and psychology, which is also true. But thank you.
Okay.
That was a lovely way to
Excellent.
put it. Yeah.
No, great session. Thank you very much for those responses.
Thank you.
Bharat. And before we close, I think we're going to have a presentation.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Just, we have a small token here. We're very happy to present this small token in appreciation of your work and your presentation and making this evening really, really special for us at the UWI VM Group Distinguished Lecture. Thank you so much, Prof.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you so much.
Before I hand back over to Dr. McNaughton to bring the vote of thanks, just want to acknowledge the presence of the Honorable Dr. Douglas Horain, former CEO of Grace Kennedy, and I understand a Harvard graduate himself. That's why he asked a tough question. Yeah.
Oh, that was him?
Over to Dr. McNaughton, who will bring the closure for us.
All right, thank you, Chair. And I'll just, as I close, just share with you my key takeaways, Bharat. Always look for spoke-to-spoke opportunities and the network effects. Connections trump content every day. And the last one, which I have to think about a little bit, because I've always subscribed to the notion that find every opportunity to replace atoms with bits. And so your idea that atoms still represent scarcity while bits are a commodity is something I got to go think about. But really interesting perspective. Okay, so colleagues, really fascinating evening. And we do have the opportunity to gather outside afterwards for a little bit of networking and a little bit of engagement. Oh, absolutely. I'll get there, Chair. So this was the third in our distinguished lecture series being done in partnership with the VM Group. And each of these lectures, each of these activities have been designed to provide thought leadership on issues of immediate relevance and concerns to society. I don't think anyone will disagree with me. There's no question that today's topic, digital transformation, generative AI and strategy, ticked all the boxes that we have. In terms of relevance, currency, and certainly having a speaker who was able to bring a great deal of clarity to the discourse, and especially clarity that makes it clear that this is both a leadership and a strategic imperative if organizations are going to take advantage of generative AI and digital transformation in general, and that we're not just, my chairman, spending money on expensive experiments, but it becomes a part of a strategic contemplation that says this is how it helps our organizations. So it's just for me to thank a number of persons that participated in the evening's proceedings. Well, first of all, again, thanks, Bart. Incidentally, we were at TVJ this morning. We sat for about 45 minutes waiting to get on for a 5-minute discussion. But we had the opportunity to speak about the events of Tuesday evening, so that was quite interesting. Bart is from the East Coast, right? So that was an interesting discussion. But yeah, special thanks to Bharat for bringing such clarity and insight to a complex topic. Special thanks to the VM Group for continuing to be a value-adding partner. And of course, Dr. Courtney Campbell, head of that fine institution, for continuing to believe in and support the ambitions of this distinguished lecture series. Thanks to all the persons who participated in the evening's program. Deputy Principal Dr. Tomlin Paul was our chair and oversaw the proceedings. Our campus principal, Prof. Denzel Williams, who brought remarks and is the ultimate architect of this series as part of a larger UEMONA outreach through advocacy and providing thought leadership to society at large. Thanks to Kaje for that eclectic piece. I'm hoping to hear a little bit more from them. So, okay, we look forward to that. Thank you to the organizing committee for this event and for the series generally, for continuing to identify cutting-edge and relevant topics and finding engaging speakers to treat with them. Finally, to all of you, thanks for your interest and attention. Thank you very much, and please continue the networking and fellowship on the outside. So, thanks. Oh, I say one more thanks. We must say thanks to GK Foods for having sponsored the wines that we'll have this evening. So, I neglected to say that. Thank you. Okay.
When you start iSaving, more things become possible. That car you've been eyeing goes from your dreams to your driveway. That big vacation moves from your wish list to a spot on the calendar. The new fridge that was once a need becomes a star of your kitchen. Supercharge your money with a high-yield iSave account. Put your savings on autopilot so you won't even need to think about it. Turn that dream into a done with iSave from VMBS. Transformation starts here. Visit transform.myvmgroup.com. Let's go. What can you do with VM's cardless IABM deposits? If you guessed make deposits without a card, you'd be right. Deposits shouldn't slow you down. So when you get cash, you can deposit it here, or your bearer can lot it there. Send money across the island here. Pay your friend back or get paid back right there. Anyone can deposit money anytime to any VMBS account at VM IABMs nationwide with just your account and phone numbers. No card, no lines. One more way your money works better at VMBS. Transformation starts here. When you start iSaving, more things become possible. That car you've been eyeing goes from your dreams to your driveway. That big vacation moves from your wish list to a spot on the calendar. The new fridge that was once a need becomes a star of your kitchen. Supercharge your money with a high-yield iSave account. Put your savings on autopilot so you won't even need to think about it. Turn that dream into a done with iSave from VMBS. Transformation starts here. Visit transform.myvmgroup.com. Let's go. What can you do with VM's cardless IABM deposits? If you guessed make deposits without a card, you'd be right. Deposits shouldn't slow you down. So when you get cash, you can deposit it here, or your bearer can lot it there. Send money across the island here. Pay your friend back or get paid back right there. Anyone can deposit money anytime to any VMBS account at VM IABMs nationwide with just your account and phone numbers. No card, no lines. One more way your money works better at VMBS. Transformation starts here.